Hello, I'm Ree, and I'm a psychology teacher and examiner who creates revision resources for AQA A Level students. This speedy revision video will examine conformity to social roles, focusing on Zimbardo's prison study. So before we begin, we'll just clarify what we mean by social roles. So a social role is a position that we play or a part that we play in society that has certain expectations attached to it. And those expectations are what we have about the role, but also what other people have about that role as well, and what would be deemed to be appropriate behaviour when playing that role. So we all identify with certain groups in society, and we can belong to more than one social group at a time. And those social groups that we belong to, we tend to favour over any groups that we perceive to be outsiders, or what we call an out group. So what we do psychologically is that we tend to really focus on and maximise the things that we have in common with the group that we're in and the similarities that we have. And we really then also focus on the differences between our group and those outside groups. So this is also known as social identity theory, and it's an underlying principle for the conformity to social roles section. So the Stanford prison experiment was conducted by Zimbardo, but also a collection of other researchers, as you can see here, and they were essentially interested in violence and aggression within the prison environment. One hypothesis is the dispositional hypothesis, which is this idea that it's something about the person themselves, that to do with their personality or a behaviour trait of some kind that causes them to act in that way. The second hypothesis, which Zimbardo believed, was the situational hypothesis, which is actually the situation itself, the environment itself, was what caused or causes prisoners to behave the way they do. And so really this was the question they wanted to answer in their research. So what was the procedure of the study? They took 25 male volunteers who had seen an advert for a study into prison life and responded to it. And then once they got their male volunteers, they psychologically tested them first just to make sure that they were psychologically healthy before beginning the research. And then they randomly allocated them to either the prisoner group or the guard group. They then asked the local police to help make it look like a real arrest by blindfolding and arresting the prisoners and then taking them to the basement of Stanford University. And here they'd set up a mock prison environment. Once the prisoners arrived, they were sprayed with disinfectant, they had to take off their clothes and had to wear like a smock and a cap, and they were given numbers to memorise instead of using their names. They were supervised at all times by the guards. They were also given work shifts, so things to do, jobs to do as prisoners, and were quite regularly lined up to be counted like you would in a real prison. The guards were also given uniforms to wear, but theirs was obviously more attributed to the guard role. So they had the khaki shirts, the dark glasses, carrying a baton as well. And these are all symbols of authority that we'll talk about later. The guards were instructed that they were allowed to make up the rules in order to look after the prisoners. So thinking about research methods for a moment, normally we would describe this study as an experiment, although it's not your traditional experiment that you might think of normally in psychology. And the independent variable here would be the conditions that the participants were assigned to, so whether they were in the prisoner group or the guard group. And the dependent variable will be the behaviour that they display. So it is an experiment. We can clearly identify the IB and the DV and look at the cause and effect here. There's an important component here to the study that we do need to be aware of when thinking about the conclusions later on, which is that the prisoners were effectively dehumanised. So to dehumanise someone means to take away their humanity, their identity, and make them seem less of a human, maybe more of an object or an animal. So in this case, the prisoners were dehumanised because they were taken into the basement, asked to strip off their clothes, deloused, and had all possessions removed. They were then given that smock uniform, were only using numbers instead of names, and they had a chain around one ankle as well. So they really did have their identity taken away, and the only identity that they had from that point on was that of a prisoner. So what did the guards do? Well, they were very quick to adopt their roles and took it with ease. Within hours, they were already starting to harass prisoners, and they were being quite brutal in the orders that they were giving them, and some orders were even quite sadistic. The prisoners were taunted quite constantly and given orders to conduct work tasks that were very much petty and dehumanising. The tasks were boring and relentless and pointless. In reaction to this then, the prisoners really started to treat the mock prison like a real prison environment. They spent a lot of their time talking about the prison and the issues they faced, and they even started telling tales on each other to the guards to win favour with them. They talked about the rules and started to see them there as a benefit to them rather than just something imposed by the guards. And some of them actually started to side with the guards against the prisoners who didn't conform to the rules. So what were the results of the study? Well, it was meant to last 14 days initially, but they had to discontinue it after just 6. Why? Because of the extreme reactions of both the prisoners and the guards. The guards continued to harass the prisoners constantly, and they got more and more brutal as time went on. The prisoners rebelled, they ripped their uniforms, and the guards would retaliate by firing fire extinguishers at them. And what had happened really was that the guards had undergone something called de-individuation. So de-individuation is where we lose that sense of responsibility and sense of self-awareness when we're in a group or crowd situation. And then we behave in a way that we probably wouldn't normally. Some prisoners showed signs of anxiety or stress and actually can become quite passive in their behaviour as well. In conclusion then, Zimbardo and his colleagues rejected the dispositional hypothesis. It's not down to people's personality or their behaviour traits, but it's actually that they conform to social roles because they're expected to play those roles in that situation. So this is a situational explanation or situational hypothesis. And actually what they believed was that in real life, these roles would be even more enhanced and the effects would be even greater in terms of conformity to these roles. Moving on to evaluation, we can talk about the internal validity of Zimbardo's study because of the elements of control that he put in place. The participants were psychologically screened, as I mentioned earlier, which means we know they were emotionally stable. And also they were allocated to either prisoner or guard role randomly. So what this means is that any individual differences between the participants can be ruled out as affecting the dependent variable, in this case the conformity to social roles. So this increases the internal validity of Zimbardo's research. However, one of the biggest criticisms is the ethics of Zimbardo's study. So many criticise him for the element of psychological harm that participants might have been exposed to, and we know this because 5 of his participants actually had to leave the experiment early due to the distress that they felt. However, he would have counter-argued this, or he does counter-argue this, by saying that he did debrief them afterwards and explain to them fully what the research was about. And obviously, the costs and benefit analysis here could argue that the benefits of what we learned about conformity to social roles outweighs the cost to the participants in terms of ethics. We could also criticise the lack of realism. This wasn't a real prison, and participants would have known that. In fact, some participants even said that they were deliberately play acting. One said that he based the role on a character from the film Cool Hand Luke. However, the counter-argument to this is that Zimbardo said that most of the conversations that they were having, 90% of them, were actually about prison life, like it would have been in a real prison. And one prisoner even said he did think it was a real prison. So this kind of goes against the idea that it wasn't a realistic setting. One of the biggest criticisms is that we can't really rule out completely the dispositional hypothesis. Actually, only a third of the guards behaved brutally, as Zimbardo said, and actually a third applied rules fairly. The rest of the guards helped the prisoners. This suggests that they all had different personalities or behaviour traits that Zimbardo didn't really take into account and actually overemphasise or exaggerates the power of the situation in this case. A more recent study aimed to replicate Zimbardo, and it was conducted by Riker and Haslam in the UK. It was also publicised on TV. In this study, though, the guards behaved very differently. They weren't brutal and they weren't trying to impose authority over the prisoners. And actually, they both tried, the prisoners and the guards, to establish some sort of fair society to live in. It didn't really work, though, and the prisoners ended up taking control and sort of being tyrannical rulers over the prison. Haslam suggests that maybe this happens when law and order breaks down and the group feels powerless. We can refer here to social identity theory, that people have to actually identify with their roles first to be able to conform to them. If the guards didn't identify with their roles as guards, then they're not going to behave in the same way as the guards did in Zimbardo's study, where they clearly did. However, there are clear differences between the two studies. The prisoners in Haslam's studies were very much aware they were on a television programme, so may have been play acting in that sense, and also they just generally seemed to be tougher and more streetwise than maybe the students were in Zimbardo's study. That said, it does tell us that it's really important to think about the social and cultural context that studies take place in. Social roles now are very, very different to how they were in the 1970s, and the way we conform to social roles now has changed. So that brings us to the end of this section. So have a go at the quiz and see how you've done. That brings us to the end of this revision video. If you found this video helpful, then hit subscribe for more revision help. And you can also find me on Instagram and TikTok for psychology related content. And of course, you can find a range of revision resources available at psychologywithre.com.